Okay, so welcome to this last plenary talk of this meeting. So of course, it's an immense honor and pleasure to introduce Ernst Fehr. One reason is that Ernst has had a major influence on experimental research and on the discipline for several decades. And another reason is that he is a former president of our association. I think it was in 2005. As you know, Ernst is a professor of economics at the University of Zurich. And after being the director of the Institute for Empirical Research in Economics, he has been the director of the UBS International Center of Economics in Society for nearly 10 years. He has also been a global distinguished professor at New York University, an affiliated member at the Department of Economics at the MIT. Ernst, as you know, has published extensively in all top journals in economics, but also in the most prestigious scientific journals such as Nature and Science. He has received many awards, including the Oscar Morgenstern Medal, the Marcel Benoit Prize, the X. Tinbergen Medal, and many others. It wouldn't make sense to try to summarize Ernst's scientific contributions in this introduction because it would not leave him enough time for his lecture. So let me just say a few words about what impresses me the most in his work. First, Ernst has produced fascinating results that helped us understand the foundation of human sociality and moral sentiments. And in particular, his theory of social preferences has changed completely our understanding of how inequity aversion or reciprocity shape the functioning of economic institutions. By exploring the psychology of incentives and motivation and the foundation of relational contracts, he has also deeply influenced complete fields in economics, such as labor or personal economics. In particular, his explorations of the fundamental role of altruistic punishment in the enforcement of social norms, or the role of conditional cooperation in groups, have had really a huge impact on many of us. And I still remember a paper, Ernst, in which you explained the conditions in which a small minority of selfish people is sufficient to drive the whole group toward low efficiency, and those in which a small minority of altruistic people is sufficient to drive the group towards success and cooperation. It was so illuminating. So importantly, Ernst has not only worked on how social preferences contribute to the success or failure of economic transactions, but he has also explored the formation of these preferences in childhood, for example, the development of egalitarianism, just to cite an example. Now, I also want to highlight that Ernst has been an early father of neuroeconomics, with major contributions to the understanding of the links between cognition, preferences, and action. And he has made really fascinating contributions on the biological, hormonal, and neural foundations of altruistic punishment and reciprocity. And in particular, his research on the brain's functional architecture has contributed to identify the neural circuitry of trust and prosociality, but also the valuation process in which individuals engage in before making a decision. So let me finish by saying that more generally, Ernst is a great promoter of the dialogue between sciences, of course, between economics and neurosciences, but also between economics and anthropology, psychology, sociology. Okay, so today it's really a pleasure to listen to your talk. Ernst is going to talk about attention and the attentional foundations of framing effects. To the audience, please drop your questions in the chat box. We'll take the question at the end for the general discussion, but Ernst will also make 2 breaks during his talk to allow you to ask clarification questions. Okay, so Ernst, thank you very much for giving this talk. We are very much looking forward to this lecture, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Marie-Claire. This was very nice of you, what you said. And I hope I can live up to the expectations that you raised. So today's presentation is actually at the intersection of economic psychology and a bit also neuroscience, because I'm relying on a model that has been developed by neuroeconomists and that has been inspired by neuroscientific evidence. So the topic of my talk is Attentional Foundations of Framing Effects. It's joint work with Gaia Lombardi and Todd Hare, who are both currently at the University of Zurich. Gaia is soon becoming a postdoc of Antonio Rangel at Caltech. Now, let me start by, now, this is what sometimes happens. I can't move forward suddenly with my, let me stop to share and let me stop sharing and again share my screen so that I can move forward. Yeah, now it works. So let me motivate my talk by pointing out these hugely influential papers by Kahneman and Tversky on framing in risky choices. I mean, these framing effects, they have puzzled scientists for a long time. Kahneman and Tversky were not the first who kind of documented framing effects, but it's fair to say that they are clearly the most influential researchers in this field. And you can see this when you look at the citations of just 2 of their papers. It's their Econometrica paper and their science paper on the framing of decisions and the psychology of choice. They have together 90,000 Google Scholar sites at the time, and they will soon have 100,000. And Reinhard Selten and the co-author Berg and Pruitt already earlier, they also showed framing effects. For example, the term decomposed prisoner's dilemma relates to the framing effect in the domain of prisoner's dilemmas. And all this evidence suggests the question or asks the question, ask for an answer basically. So why should mere changes in the description of an objectively identical relationship between choices and outcomes? That's what framing is. It's just a mere redescription of the same phenomenon. Why should that affect people's behavior? And it's a pretty fundamental violation of rationality because it violates the principle of invariance. Now, you all are familiar with Kahneman and Tversky's explanation of framing effects in risky choices. They assume that the value function is concave in the gain domain and it's convex in the risk domain, and that gives rise to risk-averse behavior in the gain domain and risk-seeking behavior in the loss domain. But when you look at their psychological explanations, then what they point out is the following. So they use metaphors. For example, they use the metaphor that framing shapes the perspective on a problem or the perception of the problem, and that this is similar to changing the perceptions on a visual scene. Like when you view a mountain from the right, it looks somehow different than when you look at the mountain from the left, okay? However, they don't provide further explorations, except that they say that these different perspectives give rise to different associations and different issues come to mind, okay? And when you look at their explanation that they are giving, it's kind of what we economists would call a reduced form explanation, because it helps us describe or redescribe the framing effect in risky choices in terms of the risk aversion parameter in the value function, basically. Okay, so let me now put forward our explanations or our hypothesis with which we started this research project. And our hypotheses were guided by a model that has been developed by Antonio Rangel and his co-authors, in particular Ian Krybich. And it's called the Attentional Drift Diffusion model. I will say more about this model in a minute, but now let me just introduce our intuitions. So we thought that if nothing changes but the description of the situation, that it then seems natural to hypothesize that different frames focus attention on different aspects of the decision problem. And that is why we then, because this focus on attention as an explanatory force is why we basically bring the attentional drift diffusion model into the picture. A second reason why we bring that model into the picture is that we have now an increasing number of papers that suggest that just merely changing the attention to different aspects of a decision problem, for example, to different options, has a causal impact on behavior. So if I focus, if I manage to manipulate individuals' attention in such a way that they focus more on one option over the other, then they are more likely to choose the first option. And let me make a general remark on this type of research program we are following here. I think there is an increasing number of research projects pursued that rest on the assumption that imperfect perception, that imperfect attention and imperfect memory are important driving forces of human behavior. So I like to call it behavioral economics 3.0, considering the phase where we documented anomalies as 1.0, the phase where we developed alternative theories of risk-taking, of hyperbolic discounting, of social preferences as 2.0, and now 3.0 might be considered as the phase where we bring concepts into bearing, like imperfect perception, imperfect attention, and memory. And I believe they will stay there for the next 2 decades and will have great potential for further insights. Now let me almost immediately go to our experiment and to the guiding theory. We want to explain the framing effect in the domain of risk-taking. So subjects face a series of binary choices between a sure option and a risky option. In some cases, the sure option is framed as a gain. In others, it's framed as a loss. We also measure subjects' eye movements and use these eye movements as an indicator of their fixations, so eye fixations, and that's a proxy for attention, basically. Because it's very hard to look at one option and think about the other. So I think it's a very natural assumption that that eye tracking captures attention in this type of experiment. Then, based on the behavioral and the eye tracking data from the experiment, we then finally estimate the structural parameters of an attention-based drift diffusion model. And we conduct follow-up experiments. I won't have time today to talk about them, but I want to mention them here. We conducted additional experiments to check whether there is indeed a causal impact of the attention manipulation on choices. And I can say only so much here. Yes, there is. We can basically reduce the framing effect by 50% when we manipulate subjects' attention exogenously. Okay, so here are the explicit questions we were interested in and that I want to address in my talk. The first and most fundamental question is perhaps the following. Does framing not only affect choices, but does it also affect the allocation of attention to the different options? That's the most basic questions. Second, are these changes in the allocation of attention associated with changes in choice behavior such that the attentional changes correlate in a way with the choice changes such that they could be used as an explanatory variable? Or in other words, do the changes in attention explain the changes in choices? Then third, can the attention-based drift diffusion model account for the framing effect in risky choices? In other words, does the model capture the major behavioral regularities such that we can have confidence into the model? And finally, what are the theoretical and empirical mechanisms that account for the framing effect? For example, does framing change subjects' valuation of the prospects, like hypothesized in the original Kahneman and Tversky story? Or does framing change the discounting of unattended options? You will understand in a minute what that means in more detail. Or does it change the drift rate? These are all parameters in the attention-based drift diffusion model. Okay, so here's the main experiment. It's basically taken from a paper published in Science by De Martino et al. On loss aversion. So we have a gain condition. Subjects see a first screen on the first computer screen that tells them that they receive provisionally 60 Swiss francs. On the next screen, they have to decide whether they want to keep 60 of these Swiss francs with an 80% probability, or whether they want to keep 48 with 100% probability. Notice that the expected values of these two options is identical as always throughout the experiment. So we have identical expected values in both options, such that it's most likely that people will be slightly risk averse, but that we don't make big changes in expected value. Now in the last condition, they also see a screen, you receive 60 Swiss francs provisionally allocated to you, and then they can again keep the 60 with an 80% probability, or they can lose 12 of the 60 with 100% probability. And clearly losing 12 of the 60 is the same as keeping 48 of the 60. So it's a mere framing effect. And this is the simple design that we have. Now, what is important to tell you is that we don't write keep 60 or lose 12. We indicate all this with colors and with rectangles and with circles, okay? So this is what, therefore we trained the subjects to understand the meaning of these symbols. For example, when in the case of probability training, they see a screen like this. They get provisionally allocated 6 Swiss francs. Then they receive these 6 Swiss francs with a 40% probability, and 40% in this partitioned pie is exactly two pieces of the pie. They have to indicate this number 40 here. They have to write down 40 here, okay, because they see only the pie. And they have to indicate whether they are in the keep or in the lose frame, and that's indicated by the color of the pie. Now, what we call amount training, we tell them you receive 70 provisionally, and then they see this. And again, they have to indicate, is this the keep or lose frame? And they have to indicate what 3 blue bars here mean in terms of money. We do this for 5 minutes, and in 5 minutes, subjects get this right basically 95 to 100% of the time. So they have no problem understanding this. Why did we do this? Well, we wanted them to be forced a little bit to look longer at these screens such that we get meaningful eye tracking data, because if they look too short, the eye tracking data are sometimes difficult to interpret. Okay, so here is the attention-based drift diffusion model that is pioneered by Krajbic and Rangel, and that has the following intuition. You have 2 options, a left option and a right option. And when the subject looks towards the left option, then the idea is that there is an evidence accumulation process taking place. And that evidence accumulation process is summarized by a so-called relative decision value in favor of one or the other options. And this relative decision value accumulates towards a left barrier or towards a right barrier. And if the barrier is hit, then a decision is made. So and the idea underlying the attentional drift diffusion model is that if the subjects look towards the left option, then that favors evidence accumulation towards the left option. Of course, the latent values of these options also play a role, how attractive these are. But in addition to the latent values, it's also this attentional push that an option gets, or the attentional discount that the unattended option receives, when the other option is attended. And so you see this basically when you go towards the left. When you look at the left, it goes towards the left barrier. When you look at the right, it goes then again in the other direction, and so on. And when it hits the barrier, a decision is made. And the nice feature of this model is that it doesn't just give you predictions on choice data, it also gives you predictions on response times. That is, the model can also be tested with response time data in addition to choice data. Now, the formal structure of the model looks like this. You have a differential equation here at the top, which measures the movement of the relative of evidence accumulation towards one or the other option. And then there is a drift rate here. It's called mu of t. And the drift rate tells you in which direction basically the evidence accumulates. And then there is kind of a stochastic noise term here that brings in the stochasticity. And this overall drift rate, the construction of this overall drift rate is the key in the model. There is what you see here in the first equation here of the definition of the overall drift rate is the delta. This is a drift parameter, and that multiplies the utility difference, the utility of the sure option minus a discounted utility of the gamble. Okay. And the utility of the gamble is discounted if the sure option is attended. So that is the key assumption in the drift diffusion model. The non-attended option, which in this case by assumption is the gamble because the sure option is attended. The non-attended option gets a discount factor smaller than 1 that makes its weight in the evidence accumulation process smaller. It's the other way around. When the gamble is attended, then the sure option gets a discount. And so we have these two discount parameters, theta gamble and theta sure, that measure the attentional discount of the non-attended options. Apart from that, we also have the thresholds. This is the B's, and we allow utilities to we have the usual assumptions as we have it in economics, that we have a utility of the sure option, which in our case is simply given by the money to the power of the money that you get when you choose the sure option to the power of alpha. And the utility of the gamble is just the money that you get in the case of a positive outcome when you chose the gamble times the probability with which you got this money. Okay, it's very simple. By the way, one important point here is if you assume these utility functions, you don't assume increasing risk aversion automatically. Okay, you have basically that's not kind of sticked into the model here. And what we can do then is, given the data, the choice data, the response time data, we can estimate the parameters of these models, which is the alphas, the B's, the discount factors, the drift rate, and so on. And the important point is we allow these parameters to vary across loss and gain frame. Okay, that's the important point. Then, but before I come to the structural estimates, I want to build confidence into the model, and I do this by just by looking at the behavioral data without model assumptions. Okay, but before that, let me discuss the potential mechanisms that could underlie the framing effect in this modeling framework. So one mechanism that can generate the framing effect here is that the gain frame could induce more allocation of attention to the sure option. And that would mean that for a given discount factor for the gamble, we would have an increase in the frequency of choosing the sure option. Why? Because there's more allocation of attention to the sure option, and this has a causal impact on choosing the sure option. A second potential mechanism is that framing could change the discount factors of the non-attended option by changing the theta sure and the theta gamble. For example, if the gain frame increases attentional discounting of the gamble, and that means that theta G becomes lower. So the weight of the gamble in the utility, in the overall evidence evidence accumulation equation becomes smaller, then a given attention advantage for the sure option will be associated with a stronger choice advantage for the sure option in that frame. Okay, so that could be an important mechanism. And then finally, framing could change the risk aversion parameter. That's a traditional story that behavioral economists have put forward, including Kahneman and Tversky. And then fourth, it could also be that the delta changes the drift parameter. Okay, now at this point, I have my break slide. So if there are clarifying questions, please ask them now that I can remove the uncertainty, so to speak, that I have generated by my presentation so far.
So you can raise your hand if you want to ask a clarification question. Yes, so Konstantinos, would you speak?
Hello, thank you for very interesting talk already. One little question I had and I was curious about, is it always the case that the one option that we look more is the one we choose, or could it be that if it's a really bad choice, it can go the opposite direction?
Yes, I think this is an interesting question, and I think there is evidence on that, and I'm not completely familiar with all the evidence, but Antonio Rangel has ran experiments where the two goods were actually two bads, two things that you don't like. And I don't exactly know what the outcome of the experiment was in that when he ran a choice experiment where there were two bads. Intuitively, one would think that if you look at two bads, then it would be the other way around. But I'm not sure whether this is indeed the case. I have to look that up again. But if you look at Antonio's webpage or his papers, he has in the late 2000s, in the first decade of the millennium, he has produced a lot of papers, and one of these papers is about choosing bads between two bads.
Thank you.
Ernst, could you clarify perhaps the difference with an EWA model of learning?
Oh, EWA, that's I have to remember what that is. I mean, I don't think that in experience weighted in the EWA, attention plays any role like it plays in the attention-based drift diffusion model. So eye tracking doesn't have this. Attention doesn't have a direct impact on choices in that model. It's more that your beliefs are affected in some way, but not basically your attention. EWA is, in my view, an attentionless model. It's totally operating without attention.
Thank you. I don't see any other question except if Konstantinos has another one, but no, Sabine Kröger.
Yeah, well, thank you for this interesting talk. For me, framing effects are about the choice of reference point, right? So how do people choose their reference point? Or framing effects is about changing the reference point. That's what your experiment does. But for me, I thought it's about how do people choose their reference point, and this is what you manipulate. So is it what do we learn about framing effects? It's from your experiment is how these reference point changes affect your the preference parameters, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly. I mean the question, how do they choose reference point, came long after Kahneman and Tversky wrote their paper on framing effects. So the framing effect just means that if you frame something as a gain versus a loss, people behave differently in a systematic manner. And of course, the story they give is there is a reference point here, and the natural reference point here is probably 0. But there is a reference point, and you change that reference point by redescribing choices sometimes as losses and sometimes as in the gain domain. And that's the framing effect. Now, another question is, somewhat deeper question is, where does the reference point come from? But as long as you accept that there is one, you have the framing issue basically by redescribing when you redescribe choices. And I think that's what we want to explain here. So we accept that there is a reference point, and we will see there must, in some sense, there must be one, because we will see a framing effect in choices. And then we want to understand what are the mechanisms that generate these differential choices, given that there is a framing effect, that there is a reference point. Okay, that's the research program that we have here.
Okay, you separate the two.
Yes, I think these are two questions. One is where does it come from? And this is then the O'Donoghue-Rabin paper and other papers that endogenize the reference points. There has been a lot of research on that, but that is not our question here. Our question here is, given there is one, and I move, so to speak, the description of the choice situation from loss to gain, what are the mechanisms that generate that behavioral shift?
The second question is, in your model, you abstract loss aversion, or you don't consider.
The loss aversion is already an assumption. A loss aversion is this assumption that the value function is steeper in the loss domain than it is in the gain domain. I mean, if you would have just a smoothly concave curve that you put in, you wouldn't see these big behavioral changes. So I think loss aversion is kind of built into the traditional story of this kink in the value function around the origin, and in principle we allow for that, if you like, by having different alpha values for the loss domain and the gain domain, because when you have different alpha values, you go. I mean, we need this. We need also. It's not sufficient to have different alpha values, but the way we capture loss, capture the Kahneman and Tversky story here is by having differential alphas, and that can be the case. So in principle, when we estimate the model with the data later on, it could turn out that all the fancy stuff that comes in through the attentional drift diffusion model is irrelevant. That could be all irrelevant. It could be all the Kahneman and Tversky story with the differential alphas.
I will take a last question, if possible, briefly. So Jianxin Wang, if you want to ask your question briefly.
Okay, hi, thank you. So I'm curious about the causality or correlation issue. So for example, in the gain domain, do people prefer sure choice so that they pay less attention to the risky choice? Or do they pay more attention to the sure choice that leads them to choose the sure choice?
I will take up these questions later during my talk. So I will explicitly address the causality issue.
Okay.
So just be a bit patient, then I come to that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
So I see no further question, Ernst, so you can continue.
Good. Then let me come to the data. So the first question I'm asking is, does the gain frame indeed cause more risk-averse choices? And this is what we see. So here you see on the x-axis, on the horizontal axis, you see the expected values of the gambles, which is always identical, by the way, to the sure, to the value of the sure option. So we kept that constant. And what you see here is, regardless of gain or loss domain, we see increasing risk aversion because the probability of the sure option rises with stake size. So this is basically a stake size axis here. But what you also see is that in the gain domain, the sure option is chosen much more frequently than in the loss domain. Overall, we see more risk-averse choices, which is not surprising given that the expected values of the two options are always identical. And if people are slightly risk-averse, then they always go for the risk, most of the time go for the risk-averse option. Okay, now at the individual level, we see also framing effects. So almost all individuals show the usual framing effect, namely more risk aversion in the gain domain. Okay, this is these bars here. The vertical axis shows the individual level risk aversion. Now, the next question then is, does framing affect the allocation of attention? And what we see here is that yes, that's indeed the case. So on average, the sure option is attended more often across both conditions, but it's significantly more often attended relative to the loss condition in the gain condition. Okay, and when you look at these two pictures, you have this rising pattern, you have this difference in the choice levels, and when it comes to attention, you also have this rising pattern across stake size, and you have this difference across the framing domains. Now, this pattern already implies an additional hypothesis. For example, when there is more attention going to the sure option in the gain frame, then we should also observe a framing effect on response times, in the sense that we should observe quicker decisions in the gain frame. And the reason is as follows. If the sure option has a systematic attention advantage in the gain frame compared to the loss frame, then that means that the evidence accumulation process towards the sure option is quicker in the gain frame than in the loss frame, because that's how the model works, you know. So we have a prediction for response times. We should also observe quicker decisions in the gain frame. In addition, the rising pattern here across stakes, so that more attention goes to the sure option, regardless of framing condition, more attention goes to the sure option with higher stake size, implies that at higher stake sizes, we should see quicker decisions because, again, the same logic, the evidence accumulation process more quickly reaches the boundary. So these are two predictions that we can test. Do we indeed see quicker decisions in the gain frame? Do we indeed see quicker decisions at higher expected values? The data tell us exactly that this is the case. So what you see here is that stake size, again, on the horizontal axis, with higher stake sizes, the log of response times becomes lower, so response times become quicker. And in the gain condition, response times are also always lower than in the loss condition. So these two predictions of the attention-based drift diffusion model are borne out by the data. Now, according to the model, there is an additional prediction we can look at. And that prediction is the following. So far, I have shown you only averages, but now think in particular trials, when people see a particular choice problem, it can happen that more attention goes to the gamble, and when more than to the sure option. And in those cases where more attention goes to the gamble, we should see a reduced choice advantage for the sure option. Okay, that's also an implication of the model. Because when more attention goes to the gamble in a particular trial, then in that trial, the attentional mechanism should work less in favor of the sure option and a little bit more in favor of the gamble, and that's what we indeed observe. So for example, here you see on the left, the gain domain, the gain frame. In the gain frame, the green line here indicates those trials in the experiment where the sure option had a fixation time advantage. And when the sure option had a fixation time advantage, it was chosen between 70 and 90% of the cases. But when the gamble had a fixation time advantage, the sure option was only chosen between 50 and 70% of the cases. So the choice advantage of the sure option is reduced in those trials where the gamble has a fixation time advantage. And the same is true for the loss frame. Okay, now, finally, or not finally, if it's indeed true that attention is a mechanism that drives the framing effect on choices, then we should see a correlation at the individual level between the existence of a framing effect on attention and the framing effect on choices. And that's what I'm showing you here. So on the horizontal axis, you see the framing effect on attention, and each dot is here an individual. And on the vertical axis, you see the framing effect on choices. And when you look at this graph, then you see that individuals that have a higher, that display a higher framing effect on attention, they also display a higher framing effect on choices, suggesting that it might indeed be the attention allocation that is a driving force here. Now, there are further important predictions for the attentional drift diffusion model. And one important prediction is that related to the question how fixation time advantages transform to choice advantages at different overall levels of the option. Let me make that clear by showing you again the formal structure of the model. If you look at these equations that define the overall drift rate, and you look at the term in parentheses, you see the following. So this is the term that's relevant when the sure option is attended. Think of a following change in the utilities. Think that the utilities both are scaled up by a multiplicative factor. So utility of the sure option is multiplied by 2. The utility of the gamble is multiplied by 2, but the difference between the utilities stays constant. The implication is, because the theta is a constant, that there is more discounting of the unattended option happening then. So that means a given fixation time advantage for the sure option is transformed into a bigger choice advantage for the sure option at higher overall utility levels. Okay, and that results from the multiplicative structure of the discount, because the utilities are multiplied with a discount factor. So that's a prediction. So we should observe in our data that with rising stake sizes, okay, but controlling, so to speak, so we have, when we raise both utilities, but keep their difference constant, we should see more choices towards the sure option, because the sure option is the attentionally advantaged option, okay? And we should observe that for a given fixation time advantage. So when we control for a fixation time advantage and raise the stake sizes at constant utility differences, we should see more choices of the sure option. That's an important prediction. And in a similar way, we should also see, that's the next prediction, an interaction between the fixation time and the sure option. And that interaction between the stake size and the fixation towards the sure option. And the reason, the intuitive reason, is the following. A rise in the fixation time for the sure option implies that this option is more frequently attentionally advantaged. That's clear. But at higher overall values of both options, a higher frequency of an attentional advantage for the sure option means that the higher discount on the non-attended option becomes more frequently relevant. And that implies that we should see an interaction between stake size and fixation towards the sure option. And we can test that econometrically with these regressions. You don't have to look at the details. So what we do here is the following. We have the sure option as the dependent variable here. It's a fixed effects Bayesian logistic regression that we conduct here. And we regress the probability of choosing the sure option on a constant, on the treatment condition, and on these variables like stake size, utility differences, and the interactions. And what you see, first of all, is look first at this here. More fixation towards the sure option, they have a positive coefficient, which means more attention to the sure option increases the choice probability of the sure option. You have already seen that with graphical data. Second, at higher stake sizes, and stake size is here the monetary value of the sure option, MS. At higher stake sizes, regardless of which regression specification you look at, we have a higher choice probability for the sure option. So higher stakes imply higher choice probability for the sure option, which could account for this increasing risk aversion over stake sizes. And finally, we see the interaction effect between the monetary value of the sure option, so the stake size, and the fixation towards the sure option. Notice when I vary MS, the monetary value of the sure option, keeping the difference between the monetary value of the sure option and the certainty equivalent of the gamble constant. So CE is the certainty equivalent of the gamble. That means the utility difference between the two options is constant, but overall stake size rises when MS rises, okay? And when we interact this overall stake size rise with the fixation towards the sure option, we see the positive interaction effect. Now let me come to the issue of reverse causality. For an economist, the claim that attention drives choice is puzzling. Why? Because when we see we see the choice alternatives. So the choice alternatives, the feasible set of choices that is available is clear. So attention is just not a variable in the traditional economic model. And so it's puzzling. And it could easily be the case that causality goes in the other direction. It could be the case that higher valued options draw in more attention, and so that the causality goes the other way around. So it's important to address this issue. We address this in various ways. We address this issue with an additional experiment where we manipulate attention exogenously and show, yes, attention does have a causal effect. And we address it here by measuring certainty equivalence. I don't have the time. We can defer that to the discussion section, how we measured certainty equivalence. We measured certainty equivalence, and when we measure this certainty equivalence, we can see whether, for example, gamble values that have higher utility relative to the sure option attract more attention, okay? And we can again look at this in terms of a regression. So when you look at this regression, you see that the dependent variable is now attention, is fixations towards the sure option. The first regression measures the percentage of fixation that goes towards the sure option. The second regression measures whether the sure option has a fixation time advantage, okay? And regardless of which regression we look at, we see the following. First of all, we see this framing effect on attention that I have already shown you graphically. In the loss condition, less attention is going towards the sure option. Okay, that's the minus sign here. Second, we see a stake size effect on attention. When I raise the stake size, keeping the difference between the utilities of the two options constant, and I raise the stake size, I see an increase in attention towards the sure option. And finally, when I keep stake size constant, but change, so to speak, the certainty equivalent of the gamble, then I see a zero effect. So basically, I don't have a reverse causality that goes from the certainty equivalent to attention. I see only an effect that goes from attention. I see only an effect that of attention on choices, but I see no effect of the valuations that the individuals have on attention. Now, let me give you a preliminary summary. So what have I shown so far? Well, I have shown that the gain frame increases attention to the sure option. Higher stake sizes increase attention to the sure option. And here comes the first ADDM prediction. Both attention effects increase the choice frequency of the sure option. Second prediction, both attention effects reduce response times. Third prediction, individual level framing effects on choice are strongly correlated with individual level effects of framing on attention. Fourth prediction, controlling for fixations higher stake size increases choice frequency of the attentionally advantaged, that is the sure option. Fifth prediction is we have a positive interaction effect between stake size and fixation towards the attentionally advantaged sure option. And finally, we observe no reverse causality from relative valuation of options on attention. And the ninth prediction, the ninth fact I haven't shown you, I just claim it to be true because I don't have the time. Targeted changes in attention cause a significant reduction in the framing effect. So given the fact that basically all these predictions of the model turn out to be, these are comparative static predictions of the model, turn out to be true, I think we can have confidence into the model. And that confidence now gives me also the confidence that when we structurally estimate the model, we do something meaningful. You can structurally estimate any model, but much of that could be nonsense if the model is still wrong. You can always fit the model, you know, you can always try to fit the model. The question is whether you have reason to believe that this is the right model. And I think what the evidence shows is, yes, we have reason to believe that this is the right model, or this model captures some basic fundamental regularities observed in the data. Here now, I give you the chance to ask again clarifying questions before I come to the structural part of the presentation, which will be very short, but nevertheless, I think it might make sense to allow some clarifying questions here.
If you have any question, please raise your hand. I don't see any hand raised so far.
Okay, either I have completely lost the audience, or I have completely convinced the audience.
Second option, I think.
Anyway, so then let me move on.
Yes.
I come now to the structural estimation part. And the structural estimation part is important for the following reason. When you recall the model, I think I have it here again, the model kind of nests the traditional explanation of the framing effect, which suggests that in the gain frame, this alpha parameter is below 1, so that indicates risk-averse choices, whereas in the loss frame, this alpha parameter might be above 1, which indicates risk-seeking choices. Okay, so the traditional explanation gives me a frame-dependent estimation of alpha. Okay, so in this sense, the attentional drift diffusion model that I have here nests the traditional approach, but it allows for additional cognitive mechanisms like attentional discounting, like the influence of attention on choices, and therefore we can have basically, we can look to what extent one mechanism is more important than the other, or to which extent both mechanisms are important, and so on. Before I show you the results of the structural exercise, let me point out perhaps something that I should have said earlier, which is the following. So what does it mean when I say, or what is the intuition for the observation that more attention towards an option leads to more choices of that option? And my psychological explanation of that fact is as follows. We have all limited working memory. Everybody has limited working memory, even the most genius mathematician. So the fact that most of us have limited working memory, in particular, I have limited working memory. I know I constantly run against the boundaries of my working memory. If we have limited working memory and we attend to one option, we just can't simultaneously attend to the other option to the same extent. And that follows from our limited working memory. That means in the evidence accumulation process, so in the cognitive process that takes place when we make choices, this is the reason, in my view, why the non-attended option is disadvantaged here. Okay, because we have limited working memory. So that is in psychological terms the essence of this discount factor, I believe. Okay, And now let's see what kind of discount factors we estimate here. Now, the first question I want to raise is, does framing change the attentional discount parameter for the gamble, so theta gamble? And what you see here is the estimated distribution of discount parameters in the loss condition and in the gain condition. And what you see here is that the discounting of the gamble is much stronger. The theta gamble is much smaller in the gain condition, okay, compared to the loss condition. And if you look at the quantities here, what you see is, for example, the discount parameter is really large. It's 0.1. So basically, the gamble is almost neglected when it's not attended in the gain condition, in the evidence accumulation process. And in the loss condition, the quantity for theta gamble is 0.25. It's important to remember 0.1 and 0.25 because when I look at the discount parameter for the sure option, we will see that the discount parameter for the sure option is quantitatively very different. What you also see here is on the right-hand side, we have divided up the subjects into subjects who show a below median framing effect, which is the top graph, and subjects who show an above median framing effect in choices. And what you see is for those subjects who show an above median framing effect in choices, this impact of the frame on the discount parameter for the gamble is particularly big. I mean, here the discount parameter for the gamble is really small in the gain condition, whereas in the loss condition, the discount parameter for the gamble is almost 40.4. So there is, which also lends support that this is an explanation for the framing effect. Now let me look at the discount parameter for the sure option. And what you see here is we have also this leftward shift in the gain condition for the discount parameter for the sure option, implying that if the sure option is not attended, it is discounted more often in the gain condition than in the loss condition because the gain distribution is to the left. But what we also see is that the quantitative size of discounting of the sure option is much smaller because theta sure is higher. You know, higher theta sure means less discounting, and that means, and that is an interesting thing, and it speaks to the working memory part. The gamble is a more complex object than the sure option. It's very easy to remember a sure amount. It's more difficult to remember a gamble because you have to remember a probability and an amount. And if the working memory hypothesis is true, we should expect more discounting of more complex objects. Actually, by the way, there's now this notion of complexity aversion in some of the theory literature. Fudenberg has a paper on that and others. This story that I'm telling you here could account, this could be the psychological mechanism for complexity aversion. The psychological mechanism could be that the more complex options are more discounted in the evidence accumulation process when they are not attended. So we have basically for free an intuitive explanation of this complexity aversion that comes from the attention-based drift diffusion model, interpreted as a limited working memory model. Okay.
Sorry to interrupt. It's just to tell you that it's 3 p.m. So
I'm done in 3 minutes or so.
Thank you.
Now, what do we observe with regard to the other parameters? Well, we don't observe a change in the delta parameter. We don't observe a change in the thresholds, but we do observe a big change in the alpha parameter, that is in the risk aversion parameter. And I skip over this, you see it in the gain domain, risk aversion parameter is smaller, indicating risk aversion. In the loss domain, the red part, it's bigger, for example, particularly for the above median framing effect subjects. They are really risk seeking, according to our estimates, which means that yes, the traditional story has bite. So the traditional Kahneman-Tversky story has bite, but it is seriously incomplete and that already brings me to my conclusions, we have still limited understanding of why framing effects occur. We don't understand the underlying mechanisms very well yet. The process model I have presented you today offers a rich menu of possible mechanisms. And therefore, I believe that this attention-based drift diffusion model is a natural candidate theory for examining these hypotheses, and all major ADDM predictions have been confirmed by the data. Attentional shifts do cause the framing, are a causal mechanism in the framing effect. And these attentional shifts are accompanied by changes in attentional discounting of unattended options. And with that, I leave it to you to kind of say whatever you want to say now. And thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Ernst, for this thought-provoking and really inspiring presentation. So it's really a fascinating research program, and probably you have convinced many of us to move to the 3.0 behavioral econ. We have some time for questions. So if you want to raise your hand, if you want to ask questions. So perhaps, oh yes, I can see a few hands. So Frieder.
Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
So thank you first of all for this very inspiring presentation. And I was wondering to what extent you could also apply this to ambiguity aversion. So if you would replace the risky bet by an ambiguous bet.
It would be quite interesting. I mean, if the limited working memory hypothesis that I have put forward is true, then one hypothesis could be that ambiguous gambles are even more complex than risky gambles, and this increased complexity of ambiguous gambles might contribute to ambiguity aversion. So in this sense, the kind of the spirit of the theory naturally extends to a potential explanation for ambiguity aversion.
Ernst, are there any heterogeneity in these related to cognitive abilities? So does it matter? Yeah.
We didn't measure that, but it would be a natural experiment, so to speak, to measure individuals' cognitive skills, or even more, measure their working memory. There are very established working memory paradigms from psychology that allow you to measure individuals' working memory. And then one should observe a correlation between the impact of attention and the working memory constraints that you have measured in individuals. And working memories, by the way, working memory has a hugely positive correlation with cognitive abilities. I mean, that has been established in psychology over and over again.
And based on these results, what could be the implications in terms of intervention? Because I guess the next step is to manipulate this attention and see how you can change the decisions people make, or the attention they pay to the different options and the decisions they make.
Yes, actually, this is related to one of my first slides, or actually maybe the very first one, where I cite a few papers. And I want to, in particular, point out to you one paper that I like a lot. It's this paper by Pachur et al. I think it's in a psychology journal. It's this paper. It's this paper here, Pachur et al. 2018. They manipulated attention in risky choice experiments, and they show very nice causal effects of attention manipulations. We also do it. So when you will see the paper, you will see that we manipulated attention. And what we did is the following. In the gain frame, what we did is we increased attention towards the gamble. That means by increasing attention towards the gamble, we want to reduce the choice advantage of the sure option in the gain frame. In the loss frame, we increased attention towards the sure option to increase the choice frequency of the sure option. And by combining both, we can reduce the framing effect. And actually, we reduce the framing effect by 50% through these attentional changes. So we exogenously change attention in this experiment, which is, by the way, a tricky thing to do. It's not so easy to do that. You have to think quite hard how you do it. But we were inspired by this Pahur et al. Paper. And the way we did it, I can tell you, the way we did it is as follows. People can not see both options simultaneously in the attention manipulation experiment. They see one option or the other, but they can arbitrarily switch between the options. They just put the right button and they see the right option. They push the left button, they see the left option. They can arbitrarily switch between the two. But we tell them in the attention manipulation experiment, we put the frame around the attentionally advantaged option, so to speak, or the option we wanted to attentionally advantage. And we told them, if you see that frame, then think about the pros and cons of that option. And we deliberately said pros and cons, so that we don't advantage one over the other. And what that does is people look more at that option and they choose it more. That's the simple manipulation we used.
Well, thank you very much, Ernst. It's really, really fascinating. I see no further question.
Okay,
So,
I also thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Well, no, it's really great. It's time to conclude now. So you have to imagine a big round of virtual applause, of course.
Yeah. Okay.
It's really fascinating. And thank you very much, Ernst.